Some cases go cold not because the evidence vanished, but because the one tool that could read it hadn't been invented yet. A Saturday morning, February 1979, Riverside County, California. The phone rings at the Riverside County Sheriff's Station in Banning, and a man on the line says there's a body off State Highway 243, just south of Poppet Flats Road, up on the ridge, in the snow. The deputies ask the obvious question, man or woman, and he says he can't tell. That detail would not let go. According to the Riverside County District Attorney's Office, the caller, the man who said he had found a body, could not say whether that body was male or female. He had been close enough to it to call it in, close enough to know exactly where it lay, off a specific highway, near a specific road, but not, by his own account, close enough to know that much. The call only got stranger from there. Deputies described the caller as argumentative. Prosecutors later called him disagreeable. He would not explain how he came to find the body. He would not explain why he was up on that mountain road in February, in the snow, in the first place. He had reported it himself. He had picked up the phone himself, and then he had pushed back on the people he'd called. Think about the shape of that. A person who finds a body and calls it in is, almost always, doing the right thing, the thing you'd want a stranger to do. That single act usually reads as innocence, cooperation, the instinct to help. But cooperation that won't answer questions stops looking like cooperation. It starts looking like something with edges. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department logged the call and sent deputies out toward Highway 243, climbing through the cold toward Poppet Flats. They were driving up to confirm what the man had refused to confirm for them. Whether the shape in the snow was a man or a woman. It was neither, exactly. When the deputies reached the ridge and looked down at what the caller had reported and would not describe, they were not looking at a man. They were looking at a girl, 17 years old. Her name was Esther Gonzalez. Esther Gonzalez was the kind of girl her family had to coax into the spotlight. Shy, funny, mild-mannered, that's how relatives described her in statements to the press, and in the account Riverside County prosecutors gave when they announced the case decades later. She was the fourth of 7 children, a senior in high school, 17 years old, born September 10, 1961. Home was Beaumont, California, a small town in Riverside County, roughly 85 miles east of Los Angeles, the kind of place where the next town over is close enough to reach on foot, and the next town over mattered because that's where her older sister lived. Elizabeth, Liz Gonzalez, had a place in Banning, the city right next to Beaumont, adjacent. You could see one from the edge of the other. On Friday, February 9, 1979, Esther left her parents' house in Beaumont and started walking to Liz's home in Banning. According to the account later laid out by ABC7 and CBS Los Angeles and confirmed in the Riverside County District Attorney's announcement, that was the whole plan. A 17-year-old walking from one town to the next town to see her sister. Beaumont to Banning. 2 names that sit side by side on the map. There is nothing about that walk that should have ended the way it did. It wasn't a journey. It wasn't a girl leaving home for somewhere far. It was the most ordinary errand a teenager makes. The walk you don't think twice about. The one between 2 places you already know, to a door where someone is expecting you. The distance was short. The destination was known. Liz was on the other end of it. She never arrived. That's the part the family would carry for the next 3.5 decades. Not a girl who disappeared into some vast unknown, but a girl who set out on a short, known route between 2 adjacent towns and simply did not reach the end of it. Somewhere between her parents' front door and her sister's, on a February evening in 1979, Esther Gonzalez stopped being a person who was walking somewhere and became a person who was missing. Liz waited. The door stayed unanswered in the wrong direction. Beaumont let her go, and Banning never received her. The towns were close. The plan was simple. The walk was routine. And that is exactly what makes the silence at the end of it so hard to hold, because nothing about the trip explained how it could go wrong. A short distance, a known address, a sister waiting, and in between, nothing the family could account for, then or for years after. She left. She didn't arrive. Everything that followed grew out of that gap. If you're going to follow this all the way to the name it took 45 years to say out loud, subscribe now, because from here it only gets harder to look away, and this is not a story you want to catch halfway. Deputies drove up State Highway 243 on Saturday, February 10, 1979, following the directions a caller had given them, south of Poppet Flats Road near Banning, into the high country where the snow still held. That is where they found her. They identified her as Esther Gonzalez, 17 years old. According to the official case record cited by the Riverside County District Attorney, she had been sexually assaulted and killed by blunt force. That is the last this account will say about how she died. Because what the investigators in 1979 kept circling back to was not only the violence done to Esther, it was the geography of it. Esther had set out on foot along a short, familiar stretch between Beaumont and Banning, flat valley ground, a route she knew, a walk measured in a couple of miles. But the deputies were not standing in the valley. They were standing roughly 15 miles away, high on a mountain highway, in February, in the snow. Per the district attorney's November 2024 announcement and reporting by NBC Los Angeles and Fox News, the spot where her body lay was about 15 miles from where she had started walking. 15 miles, up a remote mountain road, in winter. That distance does not happen on foot, and it does not happen by accident. Someone moved her there, or moved with her there, far off any path a 17-year-old would have had reason to take. So who goes up that road in February? It is not a route to anywhere ordinary. It climbs, it empties out, the weather closes it in. The driver on Highway 243 that weekend was not passing through on the way between two towns. They were there for a reason of their own. Which brings the strangeness to its sharpest point. The man who called it in, the man whose direction sent deputies to that exact patch of snow, would later say, according to the case record reported by Fox 8 Live, that he had found her there and could not even tell whether the body was male or female. Yet he would not explain how he had come to be on that lonely mountain road. He would not explain how, of all the people who never went up there, he had found her. An investigator working that file in 1979 would have to ask the plain questions. Why was he there? How did a man who couldn't describe the body still know precisely where it was? How does anyone stumble onto a teenager 15 miles from her route, on a road almost no one travels in the dead of winter, and then go quiet about every detail except the location? No one was accusing him. Not yet. But the most urgent question in the case was no longer only who had killed Esther Gonzalez. It was who had made that call. Roughly 5 days after the body was found, the trail that mattered most was the one that had walked straight up to the police on its own. The Riverside County District Attorney's Office, in its November 2024 announcement, states that investigators traced the anonymous call back to its source and put a name to the voice: Lewis Randolph Williamson, known as Randy. He was the man who found her, the man who called it in. And once they had him, they did what investigators in 1979 did with a man they wanted to read. They asked him to sit for a polygraph. He agreed. He passed. According to the DA's office, that past examination, at the time, cleared him of any wrongdoing. 3 words, doing an enormous amount of work, because they quietly concede that what counted as clearance in 1979 and what counts as clearance now are not the same thing. Here is what a polygraph actually does, generally speaking. It does not measure truth. It measures the body, heart rate, breathing, the faint sweat that changes how skin carries a current, and a trained examiner reads those tremors and infers deception from them. The results have never been admissible as proof of guilt or innocence in an American courtroom. But in 1979, the machine carried weight. Departments trusted it. Examiners built careers on it. A past test was treated, informally, as a kind of verdict. So make the honest case for the men who let him walk. A witness can be difficult, evasive, unpleasant to deal with, and still be telling the truth. None of those things is a crime. The investigators were not careless. They had a body, a thin set of facts, and almost none of the tools a detective takes for granted today. No database of genetic profiles. No way to tie a person to a scene by anything but circumstance and instinct. What they had was a man who had volunteered the discovery, agreed to the test without resistance, and come through the era's most trusted instrument clean, believing that result was not foolish. Given 1979, it was close to the most defensible thing they could have done. Subscribe before the next turn. The moment a past lie detector quietly becomes a decades-long head start is exactly the kind of thing most people scroll past and never stop thinking about. And yet, notice what a past polygraph can and cannot rule out. It can register a calm man. It cannot tell you why he is calm. It can clear a nervous innocent and pass a steady guilty one, and it cannot on its own distinguish between them. It was never proof. It was the most the era could reach, and the most the era could reach is not the same as the truth above it. The investigators seem to have understood this better than the paperwork did, because for all that the polygraph officially cleared him, the Riverside County District Attorney's Office has said he was never truly in the clear. He remained their suspect, unexonerated, because the one science that could have settled it did not yet exist. The suspicion did not close with the test. It went quiet. It sat in the file. He was never charged, never named publicly, never made to answer for anything beyond the call he chose to place. On paper, an exonerated witness. In the back of the room, a man some of them kept watching. That is the shape of the thing they were left holding. Not a closed case, not an open one. A past test standing in for an answer they could not actually get. They could not say he did it. They could not prove he hadn't. And the one technology that might have settled it, that could read a body and return a name instead of a heartbeat, did not yet exist. They had their doubt. They had a man's name attached to it. And for now, no way on earth to turn the one into the other. The man who found her had passed his polygraph, and so the case did what cold cases do. No arrest followed. The leads that had felt urgent in the first weeks thinned, then stopped arriving at all. Detectives who had carried Esther's file moved to the cases that still had a pulse, the ones with witnesses who could still be found and suspects who could still be questioned. Her file was boxed. That is what cold means. Not closed, just set down, because there was nothing left in reach to pick up. Years passed before the science caught up. At some point, investigators developed a DNA profile from evidence collected at the scene, and they ran it through CODIS, the FBI's national database. Riverside County prosecutors would later confirm what came back. Nothing. No match. It helps to understand why, because the answer is not that the science failed. CODIS does exactly one thing. It compares a crime scene profile against the profiles already stored in it, and those profiles come almost entirely from people who have been arrested or convicted of qualifying crimes. The database is not a census. It does not hold everyone. It holds the people the system has already had its hands on. If the man who left that DNA had never been arrested for the kind of offense that gets your profile uploaded, then there was simply nothing in the system to compare him to. The profile was perfect. The door it knocked on was locked, because the person on the other side had never been entered. So even after the technology arrived, even with a profile clean enough to convict, it pointed at no one, and the man who had passed the polygraph was not waiting to be found. He had moved on. Williamson left California for Florida, where, by the accounts reported by Fox News and News Nation, he lived for years. An ordinary stretch of life. He died there in 2014. Here is the part no one in California saw at the time. When Williamson died, Broward County authorities conducted an autopsy, and during it they drew a blood sample and kept it. Morgues do this. It is routine, unremarkable, the kind of procedure that fills a shelf and is rarely thought about again. As CBS Los Angeles later reported, that sample went into an evidence facility in Florida and stayed there. No detective in Riverside knew it existed. No one had connected the name to the profile because no one had reason to. A man had died of natural causes 2,000 miles away, and a routine vial of his blood had been filed in a county that had never heard of Esther. It sat there, a Florida evidence room, a single sample, holding the exact answer to a California case that by then had been cold for 35 years. The answer was already on a shelf. It had been for years. Nobody had yet thought to ask it the question. Subscribe now, because what finally happens to that single vial of blood in a Florida evidence room is the part of this you'll wish you had seen coming. Polygraphs gave you an answer in 1979. They never gave you proof. For decades, Esther's file sat where so many do, closed not because anyone was satisfied, but because the tools had run out. What changed was not the evidence. The evidence had been sitting in storage the whole time. What changed was who decided to go looking again. Around 2019 and into 2020, Riverside County stood up something built for exactly this kind of dead end. The Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team. Not one agency working alone, but four pulling in the same direction. The District Attorney's Office Bureau of Investigation, the Riverside County Sheriff Coroner's Department, the FBI, and the Riverside Police Department. Different badges, different jurisdictions, one table. Here is what a team like that actually does, because it is not what most people picture. They are not simply rereading old paperwork, hoping a missed detail jumps off the page. They are doing something colder and more deliberate. They look at the calendar. They ask which cases went cold for a reason that no longer holds. A case where the science of the time could not finish the job, but the science of now might. They are matching old evidence against new capability. By that measure, Esther's file read like a checklist. Crime scene DNA, preserved and waiting. A CODIS search that had already been run and had already come back with nothing. And a newer method, just beginning to prove itself in other jurisdictions that worked in a way CODIS never could. Every box the team was built to find, her case ticked. But a profile on a list is not the same as a person deciding it matters. Someone had to physically pull the file. Someone had to look at a name that had gone quiet for 40 years and decide it was worth the hours, the budget, the long odds. That is the part that does not show up in the forensics. Master Investigator Jason Corey of the Sheriff's Office, speaking for the team, put the reason plainly. He framed the whole effort around new technology as a tool, not a miracle, a tool. And then he said the part that explains why any of it happens at all. A lot of these families, he said, they deserve justice. 40 years, 2 states, a man who had passed and walked. By any institutional logic, Esther's case had every excuse to stay closed. Instead, a room full of people decided it was still open. They committed to running one tool the case had never had, the one thing nobody in 1979 could have offered her. If you've come this far, subscribe. What comes next is the science that did in months what 1979 could not do in a lifetime, and you do not want to miss how they actually named him. Before forensic genetic genealogy, a case like this had exactly one question to ask a database, and only one. In 2023, the cold case team packaged crime scene evidence and sent it to Othram, a private forensic lab in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram works on a specific problem, the kind of sample that ordinary testing gives up on. Too old, too small, too degraded by decades in an evidence locker. The lab's method, forensic-grade genome sequencing, is built to read those samples anyway, pulling a usable DNA profile out of material that standard testing simply cannot process. But the profile was only the first half of the answer. The second half was a different question entirely. For more than 40 years, the only tool the case had was CODIS, the National DNA Database. CODIS works by exact match. It asks one thing: is this specific person already in our system? Submit a profile, and the computer searches for that same profile sitting in a file somewhere. If the person was never arrested, never convicted, never entered, the search comes back empty. A perfect profile of the wrong kind of suspect returns nothing. The database can only recognize people it has already met. Forensic investigative genetic genealogy asks the opposite question. Not is this exact person here, but who are this person's relatives and where do their family lines cross? Working from the Othram profile, genealogists searched genealogical data for partial matches, the kind of small shared overlaps that point to a cousin, a great-aunt, a distant branch, rather than the person himself. A second cousin here, a more distant relative there. Each partial match is a thread leading back into a family tree. Subscribe before this reaches the name. The way this technique works backward through a stranger's bloodline to one person is the most quietly unsettling thing in the entire case, and you'll want to see exactly where it lands. Then the work runs inward. You take those scattered relatives and you build the tree they all belong to, connecting branch to branch, marriage to marriage, generation to generation. Two distant family lines that seem unrelated are followed backward until they meet. The point where they converge narrows the field. Then you build forward again, down through the descendants, crossing off everyone who cannot fit the dates, the geography, the basic facts of the case. The pool shrinks. A whole tree becomes one branch becomes one household becomes one name. It is the same class of method that ended the search for the Golden State Killer, the case that put genetic genealogy on the map and showed police a profile could lead them to a man no database had ever logged. And here the family tree did something the case did not expect. It did not produce a stranger. The convergence pointed to Lewis Randolph Williamson, known as Randy. Not a new name, the name already in the 1979 file. The man investigators had questioned back then, the man they had suspected and been forced to let walk. The most advanced tool forensic science could offer in 2023 had reached across 45 years and landed on the exact person the original detectives had circled and could not hold. The science did not invent a suspect, it confirmed one. But a genealogical lead, however clean, is a pointer, not a verdict. It tells investigators where to look. It does not on its own stand up in a courtroom. To close the distance between a name on a family tree and proof, they needed the one thing the genealogy could never supply: Williamson's own DNA, set directly against the crime scene profile. A true comparison, his sample against the evidence. And the only sample of his DNA was in Florida. Investigators had a name. Genealogy had pointed them to Lewis Randolph Williamson. But a family tree is not a fingerprint. To stand behind a name in public, they needed his own DNA set against the DNA left at the scene in 1979. And the man himself had been dead for a decade. His body was gone. What remained sat 1,500 miles away in a county record system in Florida. In early 2024, investigators reached out to the Broward County Sheriff's Office. When Williamson died there in 2014, an autopsy had been performed, and during that autopsy a blood sample had been drawn and kept. That vial, taken from a body by people who had no idea what it would one day answer, was the last physical trace of him left on Earth. Investigators obtained it. They sent it to the California Department of Justice Forensics Laboratory. There, analysts ran his blood against the genetic profile pulled from the 1979 crime scene. According to the Riverside County District Attorney's Office, it matched. Look at what that match undoes. In 1979, this same man had reported finding Esther's body. In 1979, this same man had sat for a polygraph and passed it, and on the strength of that needle he had walked away clean. For 35 years the machine's verdict held. Then his own blood, drawn from his body a decade after his death, in a state on the other side of the country, gave a different answer than the polygraph ever did. The instrument had cleared him. The biology convicted him. One of them had been wrong the whole time, and it was not the blood. And then the detail that turns a case file into something that sits in your chest. Esther's oldest brother, Esther Gonzalez, had gone to high school with Lewis Randolph Williamson. They had walked the same halls. The name now attached to his sister's killing was not a stranger's name. It was a face Eddie had known as a young man. Eddie told reporters he could not square it. I was very surprised, because I didn't think he was capable of doing that, he said. And then, the line that holds the whole weight of 45 years in it. I wish the guy would have stayed alive and served his life sentence. On November 20, 2024, the Riverside County District Attorney's Office made it official. In a public announcement, the DA stated that DNA had confirmed Louis Randolph Williamson as the person responsible for the killing of Esther Gonzalez in 1979, 45 years after she died. The announcement was carried by CBS Los Angeles, by ABC7, by Fox News. The name that the polygraph had let slip away in 1979 was finally spoken out loud, attached to the crime, on the record. But the announcement came with a hollow at its center. There would be no arrest, no arraignment, no trial, no jury, no sentence, no day in any courtroom, because the man the DA named had died free in Florida in 2014, 10 years before the laboratory in California matched his blood to the scene, 10 years before anyone in Riverside County could say his name and mean it. The investigators had done what 1979 could not. They had the proof. They had the name. They had everything except the one thing that would have made it justice: a living defendant to answer for it. 45 years, a vial of blood in a Florida morgue, a name, at last, and a man already beyond the reach of anything the law could do to him. They walked toward each other that night and never met in the middle. Liz Gonzalez was the destination. Esther was the one walking. 45 years later, that geography still sits with her. She was 64 when the answer finally came. And when she spoke to the press, she did not reach for relief. She reached for the thing she had been carrying. Sometimes, I wish I would have followed her, she told CBS Los Angeles. If I'd known that was going to happen, I would have followed her. A younger sister, a short walk, a decision that looked like nothing at the time and has looked like everything ever since. That is the part the technology can't touch, not the science. The arithmetic a person does at 3 in the morning for 4.5 decades. She told reporters why she never stopped. I never let it go, because I thought if it was me, my sister would never let it go. Not a slogan, a trade she made with the memory of someone who could no longer hold up her end. So Liz held up both. When the name finally arrived, she answered ABC7 and CNN the way people answer when two feelings refuse to take turns. In an email, she wrote that the family was very happy to finally have closure, and in the same breath, a little sad that he won't spend any time for her murder. Read it twice, and you understand the whole shape of this kind of ending. Closure and grievance sharing one sentence, because both are true. So name what this actually was. The family got a name. They got a confirmation. A profile built, a tree climbed, a phone call placed to a morgue in Florida. What they did not get was a courtroom. No arraignment, no sentence, no one made to sit and account for any of it. He died in Florida in 2014, free, a decade before his own blood would say what it knew. The answer arrived for the family. It never arrived for him. He was already gone, and he took the trial with him. Esther rests at Mountain View Cemetery in Beaumont, California. The headstone has carried her name far longer than any case file carried the right one. That gap, the years between the two names, is the real measure of this story. And here is where it stops being only about Esther. In 1979, a man found a body, sat for a polygraph, and the needle said what investigators needed to hear. He walked. For decades, that reading stood as the closest thing anyone had to a verdict. But understand what that machine was actually doing. It was not measuring guilt. It was measuring nerves, and nerves are not evidence. It was a stand-in, a placeholder holding the spot where proof was supposed to go, for proof that had not been invented yet. The real witness was already there in 1979, in his own blood, in his own skin. No one could read it. The language existed. The dictionary didn't. So the polygraph was never innocence. It was the limit, the highest the era could reach, mistaken for the truth because nothing taller existed to compare it against. Look at the architecture of this case and hold it for a moment. A credible person near the scene, a test that cleared him, a genuine profile from the scene that ran into the database and matched nothing, year after year. That specific shape, and the only reason any of it resolved is that half a century on, a handful of people decided Esther still mattered enough to build a team, to send evidence to a lab, to climb a family tree by hand, to make one phone call to one morgue. None of that was inevitable. Any one of them could have let the box stay closed, which raises the question worth carrying out of here. How many cases from 1979 wear that exact shape right now in storage? A suspect who passed, a profile that never matched, evidence sitting in an envelope that was filed before the science to read it was born. Not unsolvable, just unread, waiting on two things that have nothing to do with the crime itself. A sample no one has thought to test, and a person willing to decide, decades late, that the name on the headstone deserves the right name beside it in the file. The polygraph didn't lie in 1979. It just answered a question with the only tools it had. The harder question is how many other needles went still, in how many other rooms, while the real witness sat there in plain sight, waiting for a language we hadn't learned to speak yet. And if you watched this whole thing and still won't subscribe, I want to understand why. Tell me in the comments. While you're there, tell me this too. What do you think should happen in a case where the only person who could ever have been prosecuted is already dead?